After liberation, the world faced an impossible task. How do we bear witness to the Holocaust? How do we make sure that something like this never happens again? Some said we must remember the victims, speak their names and keep their memories alive. Others said we must persecute the perpetrators, bring them to justice and hold them accountable. Still, others believe that we must understand how this happened, examine the systems and structures that made genocide possible, so we can recognize and resist those conditions if they are ever to rise again. As for today, on the 81st Holocaust Remembrance Day, I want to honor all three of these imperatives. I want to remember the victims, I want to speak about those who committed these crimes, and I want to understand, as survivors urged us to understand how ordinary institutions and educated people became complicit in genocide. This understanding is not separate from remembrance. It is a way of honoring those who perished by learning from their fate. It is how we make never again more than an empty slogan. We must remember, 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, and every single one of them was a human being with a name, a face, a family, and hopes and dreams. The Nazis wanted not only to murder them, but they wanted to erase them from history, to make it seem as they have never existed. So our first duty is to remember them as individuals, is to speak their names and to restore their humanity. So let me tell you about 20 of those 6 million. On April 20, 1945, just weeks before the end of the Second World War, SS men murdered 20 Jewish children alongside 4 concentration camp inmates who had been caring for them, and at least 24 Soviet prisoners of war who had been in the school building on Bullenhuser Damm in Hamburg. "20 Jewish children, 10 girls, 10 boys. The youngest was 5 years old, the oldest was 12. And these are their names. Manja Altmann, Lelka Birnbaum, Sergio De Simone, Sarah Goldfinger, Rivka Herzberg, Eduard Hornemann, Alexander Hornemann, Marek James, Walter Jungleib, Lea Kliegermann, Georges André Kohn, Bluma Meckler, Jacqueline Morgenstern, Eduard Reichenbaum, Marek Steinbaum, Roman Witonski, Eleonora Witonska, Ruchla Silberberg, H. Wassermann, and R. Zeller. May their memory be a blessing. These children came from Poland, France, the Netherlands, Slovakia, and Italy. They came from different backgrounds, from different families and different circumstances. But they shared one fate. They all survived the initial horrors of Auschwitz. They were not sent immediately to the gas chambers. Instead, they were selected for something their murderers considered more valuable: medical research. But who were these children? Names on a list can sometimes become abstractions. So let me tell you about some of these children, so they become not statistics, but people. Individuals whose lives had value. Innocent children whose futures were stolen. Sergio De Simone was born in Naples on November 29, 1937. His mother, Gisela, was Jewish. His father, Eduardo, was Catholic and worked as a ship officer. After the Allies bombed Naples, the family moved to Rijeka in summer 1943 in the hopes of finding safety. But in March 1944, Sergio, his mother, and 7 other family members were arrested, and on April 4, 1944, they were deported to Auschwitz. At that time, Sergio was only 7 years old. Although his parents reunited later in Italy, until her death in 1984, his mother never lost hope that his son might still be alive. Rivka Herzberg was born on June 7, 1938 in Zedunska Wola near Lodz. Her father, Moshe, was the head of a small textile factory. In summer 1944, the family was deported to Auschwitz via the collection camp in Piotrków. In Auschwitz, Rivka and her mother were interned at the women's camp. Rivka was transported to Neuengamme just 5 days after her mother was taken to a satellite concentration camp in Lippstadt on November 23, 1944. She was 6 years old. Her mother, Manja Herzberg, survived the war and later immigrated to the United States, never knowing what had happened to her daughter. And then there was Manja Altman. Manja was born on April 7, 1938 in Gradom. She was the daughter of Pola and Shir Altman, a shoemaker. From spring 1941, she and her family lived in the ghetto established in Radom by the German occupiers. In summer 1944, Manja and her parents were deported to Auschwitz via the nearby Pionki forced labor camp. Her father was then sent to Mauthausen, where he was murdered during the last weeks of the war. In August 1944, Manja was separated from her mother. She was 7 years old during that time. Pola Altman, her mother, was deported to a satellite camp of Groß-Rosen in October, and she was liberated in 1944 and immigrated to the United States. And right up until her death in 1971, she never found out what had happened to her daughter. Now, these are only 3 stories of the 20 children who lived through what no human being should ever endure. Their experiences demand that we now turn to the second imperative, that we confront the crime today and for the long future ahead, no matter how painful. We must confront. The Holocaust was not only a failure of individual morality, it was a failure of institutions. Governments, militaries, bureaucracies, and even medical establishments all participated in and enabled genocide. Survivors who testified at Nuremberg trials, who wrote memoirs, who dedicated their lives to education, they constantly emphasized that we must understand the institutional dimensions of genocide. We must understand how ordinary people and ordinary institutions became complicit in extraordinary evil. And by doing so, we fulfill the second survivor imperative. We acknowledge what was done and we name the perpetrators. We do not sanitize the crime. Dr. Kurt Heusmeyer was a physician at Hohenlychen Clinic, and in order to gain his professorship, he was required to write a habilitation paper, and he chose to do his research on the treatment of tuberculosis. At the end of April 1944, Heusmeyer and Dr. Enno Lehling traveled to Neuengamme concentration camp. There, the camp commander, Max Pauli, had arranged for a barracks to be specially prepared for Heusmeyer's experiments. The trials began in June 1944. They were initially conducted on Polish and Soviet prisoners. The prisoners were injected with living tuberculosis bacilli strains in the area of the heart muscle, and the serum was introduced into their lungs via a rubber tube. At first, 2 imprisoned Polish doctors were assigned the task of monitoring the progress of these test subjects. But Heusmeyer later replaced them with 2 imprisoned French doctors, Professor Gabriel Florenz and Dr. René Quenouille. Then, in November 1944, the experiments took an even worse turn. 20 children were transferred from Auschwitz to Neuengamme specifically for Heusmeyer's experiments. In a designated room, tuberculosis cultures were rubbed into the scratched skins of the children, and the serum was introduced into their lungs, just like before, via a rubber tube. And by the end of 1944, all the children were severely ill. And from mid-January onwards, lymph nodes were operatively removed from the children and analyzed in the laboratory at Hohenlychen. In the end, all the children were confined to bed and had become apathetic. During those experiments, 2 caretakers from Netherlands were assigned to take care of these children. Dirk Deutkom, who was born in Amsterdam, and Anton Hölzel from Den Haag. As the war was coming to a close, the perpetrators faced a choice: what to do with the evidence of their crimes. And on the evening of April 20, 1945, SS Hauptmannführer Arnold Strippel made that choice. He ordered the murder of the children to eliminate evidence of the experiments. Camp Commander Max Pauli passed the order to Dr. Alfred Trzebinski, and just before 10 p.m., the children and their caretakers were taken away. They were driven to a former school building on Bohlenhauser Damm in Hamburg. On the 24th of April 1946, during the Hamburg Curator trial, Dr. Alfred Trzebinski gave the following statement regarding the event, and I quote, "The children all spoke broken German with a Polish accent. After a while, Fram came in and said that the children should remove their clothes. I saw that they were reluctant to do so and told them that they were being asked to undress so they could be vaccinated against typhus." Trzebinski testified that he gave the children morphine injections. Johann Fram then hanged the children. Fram himself later testified that he hung the children on hooks in the walls, like pictures. The 4 adult caretakers were also hanged: Dirk Deutkum, Anton Hölzel, Professor Gabriel Florenz, and Dr. René Quenouille. And at the same night, at least 24 Soviet prisoners who had been also subjected to the medical experiments were murdered. In the aftermath of the world attempted to hold the perpetrators accountable, but justice was more than incomplete. On March 18, 1946, the main Neuen Gamma trials opened at the Kurierhaus in Hamburg. On May 3, 1946, all 4 of the accused, Pauli, Dreimann, Speck, and Trzebinski, were sentenced to death by hanging for the murders at Bohlenhauser Damm. 7 other concentration camp murderers were also sentenced to death, including Anton Thumann. Johann Fram and Ewald Jauch were charged in an ancillary trial and were also given the death penalty. And all the death sentences were carried out between October 8 and 11, 1946. But not everyone faced the consequences. Kurt Heismeyer, the doctor who had conducted the experiments, faced no charges at Nuremberg. After the war, he simply continued practicing medicine, this time in East Germany. He was not arrested until December 1963 in Magdeburg. On June 21, 1966, a trial was finally opened against him for crimes against humanity. It ended on June 30, 1966, when he was sentenced to life imprisonment. And on August 29, 1967, Heismeyer died in prison of a heart attack. Heismeyer practiced medicine freely for 18 years after the war. And then there was Arnold Strippel, the man who gave the orders for the murder of the children. Strippel went into hiding after the war, but in December 1948, he was recognized on the streets in Frankfurt and arrested. In June 1949, he was sentenced to a lifelong imprisonment for his participation in the murder of 21 prisoners from Buchenwald. But in June 1967, the state prosecutor in Hamburg, Helmut Münzberg, dropped the case against him for his part in the murder at Bohlenhauser Damm. The reason given was lack of evidence. The prosecutor stated, and I quote, "The investigations did not establish with the required certainty that the children had to suffer excessively for a long time before they died. On the contrary, several indications suggest that all of the children lost consciousness immediately after the first injection and therefore did not perceive anything further that happened to them. Thus, apart from the destruction of their lives, no harm was inflicted upon them." Yet proceedings resumed in 1979 after relatives filed complaints, but they were halted again in 1987 when Strippel was deemed unfit for trial. He died in 1994 in Frankfurt, never having been held fully accountable for the murders at Bohlenhauser Damm. So this brings us to our third and final imperative: to understand, so that it never happens again. We must understand because remembrance without understanding is ritual without purpose. We must study how the Holocaust happened, what ideologies enabled it, and what institutional failures permitted it. It is only by understanding that we can recognize the warning signs in our own time. Only by understanding can we fulfill the promise of never again. Heismeyer was not seen as a monster by his Nazi medical colleagues. He was a professional pursuing knowledge. But the questions he never asked, such as whose bodies can be used for experiments, whose sufferings matter, and whose humanity is conditional, these were questions that his society had already answered for him. The Nazi state had already declared that Jews and Jewish children were not fully human, that their lives had no value. Heismeyer simply accepted these terms and proceeded with rigorous methodology. He had academic training, he had institutional approval, he had peer review within the Nazi medical system. He had all the structures we associate today with legitimacy. But none of these protected the children. Because when the foundational ethical questions are answered according to the prejudices of the time, even the most rigorous methodology serves atrocity rather than prevents it. Institutions are not inherently good or evil. They embody and enforce the norms of the societies in which they operate in. When those norms are just, institutions can serve justice. But when those norms become pathological, when a society decides that certain lives have no value, institutions can become instrument of that pathology. Even while maintaining their rigorous procedures, even while following protocol, and even by appearing legitimate. The methodology cannot save us if we do not interrogate the moral foundations upon which it rests. This is what the Holocaust teaches us about institutional and personal responsibility. This is what survivors urged us to learn. Academic rigor is not enough. Institutional oversight is not enough. Peer review is not enough. These can all serve injustice if the foundational ethical questions go unanswered. It is profoundly easy for a society and for an individual to forget, to look away, to stop caring. For decades, even the children themselves remain nameless. It took painstaking work by survivors, researchers, and journalist Günther Schwaberg to restore their identities and find their families. In 1979, Schwaberg published his findings in Stern magazine, drawing public attention to what had happened at Bullenhuser Damm. For 15 years after the war, before even the first plaque was installed in 1963, the school operated normally. Children attended classes where the murders had happened. No one spoke of it. So now the question remains, what do we do with never again? We do what survivors and those who perish asked of us. Never again is not a passive commitment. It demands vigilance. It demands education, and it demands that we interrogate our institutions, examine our assumptions, and find the courage to resist when societal norms call for complicity in injustice. Technical competence without moral courage leads to atrocity made efficient. Trust in institutions must be earned continuously through ethical accountability. We cannot simply follow protocol and assume we are doing the right thing. We must keep asking the foundational questions. Whose humanity are we recognizing? Whose suffering are we ignoring? And whose lives are we devaluing? So on this day of remembrance, we tried honoring the survivors' legacy and those who perish by fulfilling all three imperatives. We remembered the victims, we spoke their names. Mania Altman, whose mother searched until 1971, never knowing. Sergio De Simone, whose mother hoped until 1984. Georges André Cohn, who wrote secret letters to his mother. Rivka Herzberg, taken 5 days after her mother. Eduard and Alexander Hornemann, brothers to the end. Jacqueline Morgenstern, Marek James, Walter Jungleib, Bluma Meckler, Lea Kliegermann, Eduard Reichenbaum, Marek Steinbaum, Roman Witonska, Eleonora Witonski, Ruchla Silberberg, Lelka Birnbaum, Sarah Goldfinger, H. Wassermann, and R. Zeller. We confronted the crime. We named what was done to them and by whom. We did not sanitize. We did not excuse, and we did not forget. And finally, we wanted to understand. We looked at how institutions can fail. We examined how educated professionals in ordinary institutions became complicit in such singular evil. We remember the 20 children. We learn from their deaths, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that the pursuit of knowledge never again becomes divorced from fundamental human dignity. This is what never again demands, not only memory, but understanding, not only mourning, but diligence, not only honoring the past, but taking responsibility for the present and the future. May the memory of the 20 children be a blessing. May it also be a warning and a call to action. We remember. Thank you.